Good day, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar that's focusing on the affordable housing crisis, and in particular on some of the more concrete steps for building up connections and partnerships related to affordable housing and community building. My name is Catherine Sisk, and I work at the National Office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada as the Senior Program Coordinator in Justice Ministries, which focuses on a number of often intersecting social justice issues. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. We are gathering today on many different lands that have held and continue to hold significance for hundreds of Indigenous nations since time immemorial. I am working today from the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. The Presbyterian Church in Canada has apologized for its role in operating residential schools and the harms caused to Indigenous people, family, and nations. As we meet today to discuss supporting affordable housing in our communities, we acknowledge that the Church has been complicit in colonization, a system driven by actions that dispossessed Indigenous peoples from their lands and homes, and recognize the ongoing harms this has today. In the Church's apology, we make fundamental commitments, including continuing to listen to Indigenous people and to tell the truth about the past, respecting Indigenous spiritual traditions, many of which are tied to the land, and to support Indigenous-led healing and wellness initiatives, and being in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities. Some of the information and ideas we address here today can help our faith communities to lean into these commitments as we consider what it looks like to connect with and to support community organizations and services, including organizations and groups that are Indigenous-led and which center Indigenous voices and peoples, as we consider ways the Church and congregations might respond to these commitments in light of these commitments. My colleague today is Ainsley Chapman, and I will invite Ainsley to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Ainsley. So I have two roles. Half of my job is I am the Executive Director of Evangel Mission. So we have 2 apartment buildings downtown that's subsidized with supports, and we've got a day shelter drop-in center. So we're very well connected to the community. The other part of what I do is I work with colleagues at the Presbyterian Church in Canada to help Presbyterian churches across the country, envision what other things they could do with their property. Specifically, what I bring is how to add affordable and subsidized housing, as well as stronger community connections. So the goals today are, we are going to talk a little bit about understanding who some of the potential partners are in the community, what they want to need, identify some questions to think through when we're thinking about what does community and multi-purpose space look like as we start to shift the physical buildings on church properties, and talk about ways that faith communities can connect with their local community agencies. This is also really exciting because my very first job was in community development, and we worked out of a church basement in Montreal. And so it's really nice to be able to bring all of my work over the last 20 years, my current housing work, right back to its roots where I started. So why are we talking about this now? I think most people know that the faith-based landscape is really shifting, and churches of all denominations, not just Presbyterian, are really going through a period of self-reflection. Basic questions: who are we and who do we want to be? Demographics of who's going to church, how churches are really shifting, and churches are really spending a lot of time during a period of reflection and learning to try and say, in 2025, 2030, 2040, who are we? What do we stand for? What do we want to be known for? And how do we want to move? Another big shift that's happened, especially in the last 10 years, is we've seen a real generational shift where we've seen a lot of the folks who were sort of the community leaders, the social conveners, the volunteer coordinators have been getting older. And we did know that this was going to be coming. And then what happened during the pandemic is that really was a very stark cutoff point where a lot of the folks who were the community leaders, the community organizers in churches, retired or stepped away from the role. And no one has really, in a lot of churches, we just haven't seen people catch up again. And this is something very consistent that we've seen across the entire nonprofit sector. I think almost everybody in the nonprofit sector agrees this also happened with their agencies. We're all trying to figure out what to do. What does the new world of volunteering looks like? And again, using the pandemic because it was a real turning point, we saw churches lost a lot of connections and lost a lot of their community partnerships. We really saw things like partner-based and community meals and social activities in the evenings that were taking place in churches that closed during the pandemic. A lot of those activities didn't start again. So churches are feeling that sense of disconnect from the social service agencies around them. And of course, we're in a stage where we're reimagining buildings and how we can use land. Lots of churches are really hitting the point where they're realizing the maintenance on their buildings is very expensive. Portions of their building and portions of their land is being underutilized. And they're really trying to figure out how can we use this to reconnect with the community. In some cases, it's going to be housing, affordable housing, social housing. In other cases, it's just about finding ways where they can create space that can be better accessed and utilized by other community partners. And in some cases, it's going to be both. So we'll just talk, and I think one of the things that makes me really passionate about this is, you know, every time a church closes or is sold, not only are we losing that community of faith, but we're losing third space. And that loss of third space was really underestimated, the impact that it would have on communities. By communities is really underestimated. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of areas like in downtown Toronto, there is a shortage of space for polling stations where we can vote. And so it's really been in the last few years that city planners have really caught that this lack of third space or public space or multi-purpose space for community use is really harming communities. So I want to talk a little bit about what is the housing sector, because one of the things I love about my job is I get to move between the housing sector and the faith sector. So these are some of the photos. Sorry, some of the words are pulling across each other, but I love being part of the housing sector. I love the research and the visioning, and I just wanted to share a little bit for the folks from the faith community here, what it is that we're talking about the housing sector. So the housing sector includes affordable housing, subsidized housing, and that could be with or without support. So for example, I'm the executive director of Evangel Hall Mission. We have subsidized housing with some supports. Lots of buildings have subsidized housing with no support. So it looks different in every building. Supportive housing. So this is housing where maybe it has PSWs, personal support workers who can do light cleaning and housekeeping, maybe Meals on Wheels, maybe there's regular nursing visits, maybe access to medical supports, often after hours crisis care. Cooperatives are part of the housing sector, and it's really great because we saw a big boom of co-ops come out in the 70s, nothing for a long time, and now co-ops are coming up, and we're seeing sort of a renewal of the co-op sector, which is, of course, an incredibly positive way of building affordable housing. Land trusts, so we're seeing more and more land trusts. So a land trust is when a group, a nonprofit or a charity is able to start acquiring multiple parcels of land that is going to be reserved for social housing. So we're seeing a lot more work happening to try and, you know, rather than just take a piece of underutilized land and sell it because it's not being used, hold on to it until we can find a really good use for it with a social good. And all of these could be built or owned or operated, or two of these, or one of these. Not everyone has to build and own and operate. There's all sorts of different ownership and operating models, and it could be charities, nonprofits, could be private, could be governmental, and of course faith-based. And something that I've been really trying to bring to the nonprofit housing sector is churches are underrepresented at a lot of these tables. So you'll see these three pictures. One is the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Network, one is the BC Housing Association, and then there's, of course, the CHRA, which is one National Housing Association conference. There's lots and lots of others meetings that are happening across the country. One of the things that I'm trying to do is raise the profile of faith-based housing providers. If you own or if you operate affordable or subsidized housing, you are a faith-based housing provider and you have a voice. And that's something that I'm trying to do, is build stronger connections between the housing sector and faith communities that are own or operating housing. So what do we do as a sector? We build housing. Sometimes we operate housing. There's lots of nonprofits and charities that they didn't build, but they just offer the tenancy support and other types of services for tenants. Some will own the housing, they'll build and own it, but they contract other service agencies to provide that intensive tenant support because they've identified that, you know, we want to keep this building. And this is a situation that lots of churches who own housing are in. They own the housing, but they subcontract it to other agencies to provide that tenant support. Some are multi-service agencies where they've got a wide range of activities with under one umbrella. That could include not just housing, but childcare and employment and settlement services, sometimes even health services. So we've got lots of groups that can fit a lot of different activities, sometimes on the same property or across a couple of different properties in the same neighborhood. The other thing that we do, which is really exciting, is we spend a lot of time partnering with universities. So we want to know what are the best practices and interventions to get folks housed and to make sure that they have all the supports they need to be safe and live independently. There's a lot of really cool things happening right now with housing agencies working with architects and engineers and designers to try and make sure that the built environment is designed for tenants who want to achieve a level of independence and safety and community. So in some cases, for seniors, for others, it has to do with maybe younger folks, but who have accessibility issues. It could also be, there's a really interesting project happening where one church is looking at redeveloping, and the idea they're moving towards is to create housing where someone with an intellectual disability can live independently in one apartment, but their family members, like parents or a sibling, someone who's providing caregiving, can actually live in the apartment across the hall. So there's really interesting things that are looking at, rather than just building apartments, how do we create and design entire floors or apartments or properties to really make sure the built form meets the needs of the folks who are going to be living there. There's lots of buildings where you've got community service agencies housed in that building. So I can think of another church-owned property where they've got a private PSW program working out of the basement that provides personal support services to tenants within the building. And we're also partnering with municipalities, because municipalities are developing secondary plans and plans for neighborhoods to really try and make sure we're building the right housing for the right target populations. So we're working a lot with them. The reason I want to mention this is because in my conversations with churches, one of the things that I notice is this is all very new. So a church has been doing what a church does best: mission, ministry, being in their own community. And they don't necessarily know that there's all this stuff happening within the nonprofit housing sector if housing is new for them. So that's something that I'm trying to do, is help churches that are thinking about redeveloping see that there's a lot of thinking and labor they don't have to do, because the nonprofit sector has already been doing it. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, is build those bridges. And of course, we advocate for more funding, and we want better flexibility in building policies. One example is lots of churches have these fantastic redevelopment plans to put in housing, community space, worship space all on one property, only to find out that the rezoning could take years, because in order to rezone that religious property, and that can delay a project and effectively, that's one of the things that the housing sector is looking at, is how can we support churches to redevelop by encouraging municipalities to adjust their zoning so that they can put far more, a larger number of activities on one property and get through that process fast, because we need to get the stuff built quickly, and that's something that we need to that the housing sector already has its eyes on and are trying to push municipalities to make that rezoning more flexible for churches. So housing and community space. So why are we talking about this? So there is coming, I think part of it is the generation. We have a very fast growing aging population that is experiencing loneliness and social isolation. I think we've all come to see that mental health, we've really not bounced back after COVID. We're really seeing an epidemic of loneliness and social isolation, especially in cities. For a lot of folks, in order to be able to find and access, whether it's affordable or subsidized or maybe supportive housing, you don't really get to choose where you go. You go where the apartment that you can afford is. And so you've got a lot of folks who end up having to move away from their friends and family. Obviously, we want to get to a point where people can find affordable or the type of housing that they need in the community where their schools are and their friends are, their families are. But until we really get ahead of this problem, we've got a lot of folks moving to neighborhoods where they really don't know anybody. We're seeing neighborhoods change really quickly, especially in the suburbs. A lot of the suburbs that were built in the 70s, it's built in the 50s and 60s, they've really shifted. And anytime you have a rapidly changing demographic in a neighborhood, you're losing that sense of community, and that can be very jarring for the folks who are in that community, and it's also very jarring for people moving in, because they're moving into a community again that's new to them, and the demographics are changing and the culture's got to change, and there's just it's neighborhoods are really changing, and that's also something that's contributing to some of this loneliness. And we talked about the loss of third spaces, and this is happening very, very quickly. And we are losing places for people just to casually meet. And I think what we're seeing too is a lot of our online activity, online dating, online friends, online communities. There's a really good time and place for those. But I think we are starting to reconcile the fact that we're losing that in-person contact. And so I think that's something that we really need to be investing in our communities, places where people can just get together and informally build relationships with people who live close to them. When you lose third spaces, you also lose rental space for entrepreneurs and community services, things I've talked about, polling centers. One of the things, and again, when we talk about, if we also want to talk about, so for example, one of the things that happened during COVID is, when everybody's businesses shut down, entrepreneurs who ran small businesses were cut out of the initial COVID relief work because they weren't big companies and they weren't employees, or they didn't have employees. They're entrepreneurs, small companies, and most entrepreneurs who take advantage of rental space, below market rental space, often are women. And it's because they want to create a business where they can blend family priorities with part-time work, and that's a way for them to find work-life balance. And so when we're losing rental space, we're not just losing space for Girl Guides and Brownies and Scouts and NA and AA, we're also losing affordable space for small businesses, yoga instructors, dance instructors, things like that. I was at a talk the other day, and there's a woman who is the executive director of a women's shelter out of Edmonton, and this was an aha moment. She said, when women arrive at her shelter, they often come with nothing. And what she tried to describe was, it's not that they just didn't come with food or clothing, and I think that's what we think about when you go to a shelter. They didn't come with any friends. They didn't come with any family. A lot of folks, especially for women, by the time they're at a point where they're needing to rely on a women's shelter, it's because they've been alienated from their friends and family. And one of the things that this executive director said was they actively encourage community neighbors to be additionally friendly and to make sure that their clients are being invited. I think this maybe is more for the transitional housing portion rather than the immediate emergency shelter. But it really just highlighted again, even at EHM, when folks come out of the shelter system and move into our apartment buildings, they also didn't necessarily choose that neighborhood. That's not necessarily where their friends are. They're just here because that's where the cheapest rental space was. And so that's something that we're really, as a sector, is trying to understand is we need to make sure that we're connecting housing and community. And one of the ways that we're trying to do this is making sure that we're creating and preserving community spaces. Another thing that's really happening a lot in smaller neighborhoods is, there's a time where communities, every sort of, especially in larger centers, you had multiple small community centers all over the city. And what's happening is as those come to the end of their life and the roofs are hitting the end of their life, municipalities are starting to build these large multi-purpose plexes. These big, they've got an arena and a library and this and that and a huge parking. And so there's a lot of really fantastic things that you can do with these great big plexes, for lack of a better word, but you're losing access to that small community center. So when you go in, if you're a kid playing basketball, you're not necessarily playing basketball with kids from your community. You're playing basketball kids from, a 5 or 10 kilometer or more radius. If you're going to a seniors activity, you're not going with folks in your community. You're going and meeting folks from other neighborhoods, which is great. But again, we're losing that small space and that community space in smaller neighborhoods and in the suburbs where you can just pop in because you don't want to drive or organize Wheel-Trans or take the bus across town. You just want to go for a walk, pop in, have a coffee, meet a few other folks, and then go on your day. So what are some of the benefits to churches for making sure that they have vibrant and inclusive community space? I think the very obvious one is rental income, and that can vary. So, daycares, obviously, big source of revenue, even for churches that want some revenue, but maybe are willing to provide slightly below market to nonprofit daycares. There's a real shortage of space. That's one of the challenges that we've had with childcare in Canada. And why there's a shortage is because there's not enough affordable spaces for nonprofit daycares to operate. So these are some of the things to think about but at the end of the day, it does provide some rental income. Having activities in your space also can raise your profile and strengthen your connections to the community. And, there was a time when churches were sort of the epicenter of community activities. And that's something that community space, if you can create it a way to anchor, you can bring folks into your community space. And that's a way to sort of strengthen your connection. One example is if your space could hold like a nonprofit based out of that, then you've got a lot more activity coming to your specific area, like to your part of the block. And that's a good way to draw people in and make sure that that space is really utilized. I think a lot of churches look at some of the underutilized space in their buildings and say, this is such a great, big, beautiful room, but it's only used a couple of hours a week. And so sometimes partnering with a community service agency or social service agency to rent that out is a way of making that space a lot more attractive for folks to come and rent or use on a short-term or part-time basis. One of the things that's, because we're talking about the loss of third space, is now agencies like United Way, Ontario Arts Council, Canadian Council for the Arts, there's a lot more awareness of the fact that there is a loss and a shortage of affordable space for nonprofits. And so a lot of them are helping now with planning. So if you're thinking about renovating your basement for community space, or maybe you're actually looking at tearing down the church and rebuilding it, if you create some dedicated community space, it's a way to add more funding to what's called your capital stack. So you can start trying to access different types of funding to help you build that vibrant space that's relevant to the community. So what is a community need? And one of the interesting things is, on one hand, churches are experts in their community. But like I said, a lot of churches over the last decade have lost some connections between COVID and the loss of volunteers. So one of the things we want to make sure we're doing when we're thinking about what's the space going to look like, is what is the community need? And we want to make sure that we're going on evidence and not assumptions. So again, this is sort of an area where churches don't have to do this thinking. A lot of municipalities have neighborhood and secondary plans that actually already identify where housing and support services are actually needed. And so it could be that as a church is coming to terms and thinking through, well, we have an epidemic of seniors loneliness, or a lot of seniors in our neighborhood, we suspect that we probably should have more community services and housing for seniors, but you want to test that assumption just to make sure that your gut is actually in line with what the city has identified as what your neighborhood or region needs. Nonprofits also do a lot of research. So, we have to spend a lot of time being clear about what the community needs. A great example is for EHM. We started, many, many years ago, we had a youth program, and it was a fantastic program. Everybody loved it. There was no youth programming in the neighborhood. And then over a period of a couple of decades, we suddenly realized it was getting harder and harder and harder to support these youth programs. And we did a scan to see how many youth are in the neighborhood and how many services are already there. And what we found was that there was actually, since we started this program, a whole bunch of other youth programs that had cropped up in a 2-kilometer radius. And we also had to admit that they were doing it better than us. And so what we did is we said, you know what, I think then we can step back. Maybe youth is not the target population for us. And so we stepped back and we closed the youth program. We got everybody connected to other youth programs that were in the neighborhood. But that takes a lot of, we really had to sit down and say, is there still a need for that? And who needs it, and who's already doing activities? So nonprofits are already doing a lot of this work. And they know exactly what needs to happen in different neighborhoods around the city. And this is not to say you guys should be, churches should be spending a lot of time reading reports, because it's a lot faster just to make a couple of phone calls and have some face-to-face discussions. There's no, I was having a conversation with one church and they said, well, we downloaded the secondary report and we're trying to work our way through it. And my recommendation was, I think that's good, but have you called your city councilor? Because your city councilor often will know what's needed in the community. Not always. Housing associations, housing coalitions, social planning councils, every municipality is different. But I would just go and reach out and start having coffee, invite folks for coffee and just say, tell me what's happening. What are the needs? How is the community shifting? And is there some way that we might be able to help in this process? And other denominations, the different communities, when I've had conversations with churches, the first thing they said is, oh, who's doing this really well? The Anglicans. Oh, I heard about this United Church down there. So that's another thing, is check out with other denominations and see what they're doing. And there also might be opportunities for you guys to work together. The other thing is to figure out what's already underway. And one of the things, that I've really felt is churches have not been not for intentional reasons, but they have not been included in community planning in a meaningful way. At this point, I don't really know if it's because they weren't invited. I think it's probably more of especially like during COVID, no one had capacity to necessarily participate in this. So what I feel as an outside observer, having all these conversations with planners and cities and churches and community agencies, churches haven't really been at the table in a lot of this planning. And that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out is why and how can we shift that. But just because a church hasn't heard that there's something happening doesn't mean it hasn't already been sort of locked in by a municipality. So one of the things that I find is that sometimes church volunteers put a lot of pressure on themselves that I have to do all this research, when in fact, a lot of this stuff is, priorities have already been set for the neighborhood. Just no one's told you. For reasons, like I said, I'm trying to figure that out. But that's something where it could already be underway. Oh, I've already covered this. There's also a lot of planning happening around transit planning, park planning, new developments. So there have been situations, another great example was I was having a conversation with a church and they were trying to decide, do we do single family homes? Do we do seniors? We're trying to think through what we do. And they said, well, there's a senior centers across the street. I said, well, that's interesting because if you can demonstrate to the city that you've got, multiple seniors housing and a center that's providing seniors programming, you also collectively then build a case to get seniors transit to and from your neighborhood. So sometimes working with other partners and building up supports for a particular target population can give you leverage to work with your municipality to get a bus or some sort of transit in that area. It can also happen really suddenly because, like churches, as they are struggling with leaky roofs and cracks in the basement, schools, libraries, municipal buildings, they're all going through the same thing. And you can have a library or a municipal service, like maybe a childcare program that had intended to be at that location for 20 years to find out they've got 2 years and they're not going to have to get out. And they may be a perfect partner to roll into your building, either maybe doing some renovations to expand the building, move into the building the way it is, or if you're looking at a full redevelopment, those can be some fantastic partners. Many of them also will come with funding. So effectively, if a municipality is struggling and they're stuck with where are we going to send this library, that's an opportunity for you to potentially negotiate more funding from the city. If part of your building or your property can accommodate the library, that can help make your project feasible. Okay. So when do you start looking for partnerships? It depends, and no one likes this answer. The challenge with going too early and you get really excited is that you don't want to be in a situation where you get your community partners really excited and then you start getting, mutually start putting out expectations. Oh, we're going to house a library or we're going to partner with the food bank, and people get really excited only for you to find out later that maybe the property won't be able to hold that particular type of service. Or maybe as you go through the planning process, you say, we want smaller community space and more affordable housing. So there's a lot of work you have to do to sort of figure out what is appropriate on your land, what can and can't be done. But the other flip side is if you wait too late and you get too far in your designs and approvals and construction planning, you don't want to create a space that isn't functional. And for community agencies to come in and say this, that's a beautiful kitchen that you've put in, but we actually can't run a food bank or meal program with that type of equipment or with this type of layout. So it's something that you need to think about, and just don't promise things too early, and make sure that it's really clear that this is just exploratory. But you also don't want to wait too late, because you want to be able to, if you are really moving forward with an agency, you want to make sure that the space is created so that it meets their needs, and no one's just kind of like banging their heads. That's like, oh, that door is in the wrong place. It's constantly causing a lot of problems. So the very first thing is start with understanding what can and can't be done in your land. And lucky for you, there's a Presbyterian team working with Presbyterian churches that will help you do that. So reach out to me if you have questions. And that's the first thing that we're going to start doing, is helping you understand what is even possible on your land before you start, getting really excited about calling your local food bank to say, we want to partner with you. Definitely be optimistic, but also be realistic, because some redevelopments are not going to work. It could be that it could be based on size of the lot. It could be location. There's lots of things. I'm pretty good at finding ways. Like, there's always a way to make something work, but you also just want to be realistic before you get too excited. And when you're talking to partners, just be very honest. We're exploring local needs. We want to help. We want to be more relevant to the community. We want to use our space. We have a lot of unanswered questions, and that's okay to say. And nonprofits usually will be very happy to talk to you about that, even at the early stage, as long as they know there's going to be a long road of discussion and things that have to be answered before they'll have an answer. So who should you go after in terms of looking for partnerships? You really need to be clear about what your mission, goals, and values are, because not all partners are going to be right for you, and that's okay. But what you want to make sure is that you're really clear about who you are before you start talking to people, because again, you don't want to go down a road where you have two partners getting really excited only to find out that maybe there's value alignment. A great example is Girl Guides. Recently, Girl Guides came out with a policy. This is part of their inclusivity strategy, where they have advised the folks who are organizing space only to use places of worship as a last resort. And if you do hold your meetings in a place where there's worship taking place, that the space has to be very inclusive. And for some, anyway, you can, so effectively what you want to be able to say is, would we be okay with this? And if you're not, that's okay. This is your land and your property, and you want to be successful. And just, you need to make sure that you know who you are and what kind of groups and what kind of values and what kind of target populations do you want to be working with. And you just want to make sure you're clear about that before you go down too far in a road and realizing that there's a mismatch. And the general public, and this is, they're changing the relationship with faith communities, and Girl Guides is a really good example of that. And so that's just something that you're going to need to think about is, again, what is your physical space? What can and can't you live with? Could you live with a space where there is lots of different symbols in it? Do you need to create a space, and are you comfortable that has no faith-based imagery in it? So these are some of the things you need to think through. And make it clear, make it public, put it on your website, put it on social media. If this is who you are, be proud of it. And it also helps another social service agency or community partner do a quick scan and say, maybe they're not going to be a good alignment for us, and that can just make it a lot easier and eliminate challenging conversations. So I'm going to pass it back to Catherine to say, how can the church respond?
Thanks, Ainsley, for that. So this part of the presentation is largely based on what are actions and statements that the church has said in the past, and how does that sort of give us information about our conversation here today. So all of I'm only going to talk to 2 slides. This won't be long. All of the quotes that are on the screen are taken from the Presbyterian Church in Canada's General Assembly Acts and Proceedings. They're all they're either recommendations or parts of recommendations that have been adopted by the General Assembly. And content warning here, the language in the quotes reflects the time and the context in which they are written. If I'm reading some of them, you might hear me censor myself as I'm reading, but the original wording is on the screen because I think it's important for that to reflect what the church said in that time and space. The church recognizes that housing is a basic need and advocates for social housing and acknowledges the role that safe and adequate housing plays in reducing poverty and influencing things like public health determinants. Recognizing, for example, that inadequate housing increases the likelihood of poor health or poor education outcomes, for example. The church also encourages congregations and presbyteries to support things like seniors and public housing initiatives, and has advocated for guaranteed annual income to alleviate poverty. There's a section on the Presbyterian.ca website called the Social Action Hub, and what that is, it's a chronology of actions and statements that the church has made on a wide variety of social justice issues. There is an entire subsection on housing that you can take a look at to get sort of a bigger picture of what the church has said over time. Some of those statements go back to the 60s, sometimes before that. But on these next 2 slides, I'd like to take a closer look at some of the statements and actions the church has made that acknowledge the need for community connections and supports with regard to responding to affordable housing crisis. So the first quote on your screen is from 1968. We call upon the presbyteries and congregations in our church to engage in honest study of their communities, to identify the needs for adequate housing for a variety of people with vulnerable circumstances, and then to pursue a course as God directs, whether through private or congregational action or through public or political channels, to the end that the people living in inadequate housing might be improved. And the second paragraph says that the government of Canada and governments of the provinces be encouraged, this is an advocacy measure, be encouraged to consider the human factors and values related to mass housing projects, and that provision be made within these for such necessary facilities as those of recreation, child daycare, etc. This first quote encourages congregations to do a needs assessment in their communities and then lists some of the potential situations that could require different sorts of needs and responses. It's encouragement to think about whether there are different needs for a variety of circumstances before making decisions about certain pathways or capacities that a congregation has or could take, be it through advocacy or direct action. The second paragraph addresses community space, acknowledging that as critical as housing, as affordable housing, the structure of housing actually is, a community cannot serve its people without a variety of critical services, including things like recreation spaces and childcare. The quote from 1970 states that, quote, a local congregation, sorry, back one slide, Ainsley. Sorry, Ainsley, can you go back a slide? Thank you.
Has it gone back?
Yeah, thank you. That local congregations consider participation in government programs or initiating programs themselves to work with people in whose midst they are established, also making their premises available. And then it lists a variety of things, including daycares, language classes, drop-in centers, etc. This quote from 1970 outlines the scope of community space needs even further, listing all kinds of services. And critically, these sorts of initiatives are based in, quote, I've got that language in bold, working with people in whose midst they are established, end quote. This encouragement is an invitation to ask, who is our neighbor? Let's not guess or plan in silos, but connecting with our neighbors, listening, learning to see if there are ways of supporting needs that are identified by our neighbors. The next quote is on the next slide, and it's from 1987.
Has it moved forward?
Yep,
Okay,
it
good.
has, thanks. In 1987, that congregations identify and approach existing social agencies whose mandate it is to meet housing needs and to determine their concerns and recommendations. And then there's a second part that congregations act as facilitators and advocacy spokespersons for housing needs in their community. And then a third part that congregations consider offering space. And in this case, this was a particular recommendation that says free of charge to help tenants associations so that tenants can speak on issues of priority to them and can carry more weight by speaking collectively. These 3 points are actually part of a single recommendation that forms a much longer list of actions that congregations were invited in that context to take regarding housing. I'm highlighting these particular points because they address not just the need to develop affordable housing, but they point to several different kinds of actions that can support this, including advocacy and providing community space. There's an emphasis on connecting with knowledgeable community partners who can help identify both community needs and pathways to address those needs that reflect the experiences of people in the community. And essentially, it's encouragement to leverage this expertise. The second bullet addresses advocacy. Advocacy can be frustrating if you don't see the results that you hope for, and it can be difficult to assess the impact. That said, advocacy also plays a really important role for building relationships with not just community partners, but also with decision makers. The third bullet invites congregations to consider where their church space could be used to support community groups. Not every group and every connection is going to be aligned or is going to be a good fit. But it's an invitation to think about the different ways that church spaces can support people in its community. And the final quote is from 2022. And it says, congregations are, quote, encouraged to choose an initiative dealing with housing that holds potential in their community and to write to or engage in dialogue with elected officials. And then there's a second quote that's from a different part of those recommendations. The congregations and presbyteries write to their members of parliament, encouraging the government to increase affordable housing and provision of the following supports: short-term financial assistance for victims of domestic violence so that they can access safe housing, and the promotion of services that are trauma-informed, victim-centered, and culturally appropriate for those experiencing domestic violence, including shelters, housing, counseling, and legal advice. The 2022 report, that quote is from a report that was written during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was a time when the affordable housing crisis spiked, and where the circumstances exacerbated domestic violence situations, increasing even more the barriers faced by people who perhaps would have been seeking to leave situations of violence. And I'm lifting up that example particularly today because November 25th is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And while it's not women alone who face domestic violence, a lack of a safe, affordable housing is a critical barrier for everyone, including women, who are seeking to leave violence at home. And when we consider what is needed to support vulnerable people, no matter what the circumstances or context, it's vitally important that services and supports are appropriate to the needs of the people that they are meant to support. So that's one example of a statement that the church has made in the context of a particular group of vulnerable people. Taken together, these examples emphasize a model of response that comes from a form of discipleship that isn't driven by our own assumptions or expectations, but rather point to a foundation of care, love, service, and support for our neighbors, for the flourishing and well-being of all people in a community. The last slide just has a couple of websites that can be helpful. The redevelopment resources piece, that's a group that Ainsley connects with. That's when she said earlier, we can help. We have a group that's working on this. The link goes to a webinar where it's an outline of who is on that group and what is the expertise that's available. And then under education and advocacy, there are two websites, or two web pages, excuse me, on the national site that address the Social Action Hub. That's what I spoke to before. It's a place where there is a summary of church statements and actions on a variety of social action issues, and also resources are available in that space. And there's also an advocacy page where you see things like what letters from the moderator have gone to government to advocate on specific issues. And there's also places where there are template letters available for anybody who would want to write their own letter.